Welcome back to Africa Science Focus, the weekly science show from SciDevNet. I'm Ogechi Ekeanyo. We're back for our Science Explained series, and this week we're exploring artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is now ubiquitous, and it will impact the world in ways we can only imagine. Already, artificial intelligence is impacting how information is spread and used in Africa. Researchers are using it to develop new technologies in a wide range of fields, including healthcare, agriculture, education, and even finance. Artificial intelligence is also enhancing the efficiency of services and aiding businesses in their growth. Our reporter, Michael Kaloki, spoke to Barbara Glover, Program Officer at the African Union Panel on Emerging Technologies. She spoke to us about the potential artificial intelligence holds for enhancing development on the African continent.
In terms of artificial intelligence, it holds immense potential for Africa's development. Most recently, the conversations around AI have strengthened on the continent, especially with the advent of ChatGPT. When you look at various sectors like healthcare, education, agriculture, and even in our financial sectors, it would identify that artificial intelligence-powered tools hold immense potential in addressing some of the challenges that we have. For instance, in healthcare, when you look at our stressed healthcare systems and healthcare personnel that are working in remote areas, AI-powered tools help in accurate diagnostics. Where there are resource-stressed centers which do not have some of the machines or effective diagnostic tools for early detection of disease, AI-powered tools offer that potential remotely. Where we have quite limited trained personnel in some communities or some areas, AI holds the potential for accurate diagnosis. It helps in bridging that gap in access to medical expertise in some of these remote areas. It helps with early disease detection in some health centers where you don't have accurate diagnostic tools. When you look at fields like agriculture, where we want to look at revolutionizing our farming practices, we can use AI in addressing, for instance, soil analysis, optimizing irrigation practices, enhancing fertilizer use, increasing higher crop yields, and just overall ensuring food security. When you look at areas like education, where we have challenges with overcrowded classrooms in some areas and various learning practices, looking at personalized learning platforms, addressing challenges with overcrowded classrooms by employing remote access through AI. We can use AI tools to optimize our educational sector and ensure that regardless of where a young African child is, they have access to quality and affordable education. It has so much potential for the continent, and we are looking forward to fully harnessing that.
Barbara, what is the current state of AI adoption and research in Africa?
There has been significant strides when it comes to AI adoption on the continent. The landscape is still evolving when it comes to research. We have some lead countries, powerful economies like South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, doing some tremendous work when it comes to AI research. When you look at institutions like the Center for Science Innovation Research, when you look at the startup ecosystems that are available, all these hold immense potential for the what we tend to gain from the continent. We have startups within the financial sector like Flutterwave. We have also organizations like Trigger Foods that is using AI in the agricultural value chain and strengthening that. We have also AI research centers and initiatives that are popping up in various countries like Morocco and Egypt. We do identify that the continent is having an increase in appetite for AI, and the research space is expanding accordingly.
It is important to address challenges that AI may portend for Africans so that it benefits them. Abake Adenle is a Nigerian engineer and entrepreneur. She's the CEO of Ajala, which is a startup that develops speech technologies for African languages. She spoke to us about how her organization utilizes AI.
Ajala is a tech company that offers speech technologies that support African languages. So I think at this point, we're all kind of familiar with voice assistants, automated assistants that kind of talk to you and understand what you're saying. And we kind of build the solutions that support this sort of interaction, but in African languages. And we have a focus on serving enterprises and building solutions that enable enterprises to use our software. So we provide solutions like voice recognition, speech synthesis, voice authentication, language detection, and we support, I believe, the largest number of African languages of any technology provider. We also support a variety of what we call Western or colonial languages, but in African accents or regional African accents. And I believe we are also the first company to offer a voice recognition software that supports Pidgin English. That's something that we launched earlier this year. At least it's in private beta, but it's being actively used. And so, in terms of how we use AI, we are developers of AI solutions, and we support the adoption of these AI solutions in the African market.
Now, you have been exploring how AI is used and can be used by enterprises on the African continent. What have you found out?
The key theme is that we're still sort of early days. Adoption is still in its infancy, adoption of AI solutions. And I think there's definitely increasing interest. This increase is very much sector specific. So we see a lot of interest or a lot of focus on sort of healthcare applications and agribusiness, which makes a lot of sense because agriculture is sort of a key contributor to GDP across a lot of African countries. And so we see interest from a tech perspective to introduce AI solutions to help improve efficiencies. But as with broader AI trends beyond the continent, there's still a lot of unanswered questions around things like product market fit. So ultimately, with enterprises, a solution is only as viable as the revenue it can generate. And even beyond Africa, I think there's still a big question around how to monetize at scale AI solutions. And that's definitely true in Africa as well. There's also concerns around sort of the regulatory frameworks in which AI solutions are going to be operating. So we have a lot of countries that are starting to introduce data privacy, data protection laws that will shape how services will be delivered and how AI products will be developed. And I think that as the regulatory landscape matures, we'll see sort of maybe a firming of the ground in terms of how AI services are used in Africa. And of course, there's hype. There's a lot of hype at the moment around what AI can be from a product perspective, from a revenue generating perspective. But I think it's important to know that a lot of African enterprises are still undergoing various forms of sort of technology transformations. Large companies are obviously, far along the sort of technology transformation plan in terms of digitization, but there's still a lot of companies that aren't fully digitized. And then you add sort of AI into the mix. And really, I think that a lot of effort has to be put into designing solutions that really make sense for African businesses, for African consumers to achieve that product market fit that will ultimately make AI usable and scalable across the continent.
Artificial intelligence has the potential to transform Africa, but it is important to be aware of the challenges and risks associated with this technology. One challenge is that artificial intelligence systems are trained on data, and if that data is biased, the AI system will also be biased. This could lead to discrimination against certain groups of people.
We've identified that biases in AI has become a critical issue. When you look, for instance, earlier I mentioned how AI can be used in diagnostics. You'd identify that there has been some biases due to the learning or the training data that was used for the AI tools. And so because most of this data comes from other regions outside the continent, it struggles to accurately diagnose diseases that are more prevalent in Africa. In the same vein, when you look at language models that might not really identify African languages that we have, it's not able to accurately translate, and so that limitation is experienced when it's used on the continent. You also look at facial recognition systems, which are used, for instance, in some countries for crime detection. For instance, they've been identified biases for these recognition systems to dark skin tones, for instance, which then becomes a disadvantage to the African population, of which a majority are dark skin tones. The risks of these are substantial because it reinforces some of these existing inequalities and discrimination, and also hampers some of the potential benefits that we can experience from AI. And so we believe that it's very important to address these. And within the continental strategy, we are looking at how to address some of these biases on the continent effectively.
How significant are these risks, and what can be done to ward against them?
We identify that if you want to encourage the use of a new technology or innovation, you want the users to be confident in the outputs of it. And so if there are biases which are strengthening inequalities and discrimination, it sort of hampers the early adoption of the technology, and that then leaves Africa significantly behind with the global space in terms of AI adoption. And so to mitigate some of these biases, we are looking at bringing on board African expertise to diversify some of the training data that is out there to ensure that African culture, African ethics and values, African languages, and the data on our health diagnostic tools are clearly representative of the African population. We also think it's important that we audit AI systems for bias and ensure that we sort of have a fairness-aware algorithms that can detect and correct bias during the development of some of these tools. We also want to look at the transparency in all these AI development projects that are on the continent or are being adopted from outside the continent, and ensure that these involve our local communities and also support our ethical guidelines when it comes to the adoption of tools like AI. We also, because we work with regulators and policy and decision makers, look at the important role of regulatory frameworks in ensuring that we have responsible AI use across the continent, ensuring that policies are enacted that would support, that would require that AI developers ensure that bias is mitigated in their systems to promote the transparency around AI and encourage early adoption of the technology.
What are the implications of biases in artificial intelligence? Abake also gave us her perspective on this issue.
Yeah, I think that, there's been a lot of talk around bias and AI bias over the last couple of years, and biases really are context specific. And I think that it's important to maybe take a step back when we say AI. What we're really meaning is sort of machine learning models, some models that are learning some relationship between some data and some expected output pattern of response. And I think that where these models have been trained to recognize sort of specific patterns or trends on data that maybe isn't very well generalized, that's where we face the issue of, that's where biases can come into play. And, obviously the models can be trained for different contexts. So I mentioned earlier that my company works on speech technology. So in our context, audio is very much important. So for example, we wouldn't train models that would work on Yoruba, for example, on just English data, because that really wouldn't deliver a model of high accuracy. And if we were to use the output of such a model, we probably wouldn't be getting information that was very reliable. And that extends to other contexts, say facial recognition, or solutions that are dependent on or making decisions around, say, skin tone or facial morphology, i.e. shapes of your nose or mouth or eyes. If these models are trained on data that's sort of specific to contexts that are not relevant to African consumers or African users, then the outputs of these models are likely to not be relevant. And I think that this is where it's important for us to consider the way these models are used. So in reality, there are biases in almost every system that's developed. And that's because man-made systems are naturally inaccurate. They're an approximation to a natural phenomenon that we can't really encapsulate perfectly. And so it's not really, in my mind, or from my perspective, it's not really so much a question of the fact that these models have biases, but it's more a question of how these models are deployed. So, for example, if an enterprise deploys or adopts an AI, a quote-unquote AI solution, do they have frameworks in place to mitigate against risks? Or are they assuming that this is some sort of all-knowing genie that can answer every question perfectly? So I think if from an enterprise perspective, we're adopting AI solutions, that necessitates the development of frameworks to mitigate the risk around sort of adverse decisions or unintended consequences. And I think that from a user perspective, it's also a question of kind of understanding what AI is and not anticipating an interaction that is entirely seamless, but accounting for the fact that maybe the information that you're getting from this thing is not entirely correct, and just imposing checks and balances. But I think that this topic of bias is very interesting because it's treated as, I think, probably the risk that is at the forefront of mind when we're thinking about AI solutions. But I think that there are probably some other risks that are maybe even a little bit more prescient or a little bit more immediate. So I think that something that comes to mind is the fact that data centers are popping up across the continent in large numbers. So there's a lot of investor interest, a lot of private equity interest in investing in data centers and sort of what we call what we like to call the value chain of AI, the infrastructure piece of sort of AI dissemination and distribution. And data centers are sort of notoriously known for consuming a lot of resources, especially for cooling. And this is not just specific to Africa, but broadly, data centers largely use a lot of water for cooling. And when we think about an African context where water scarcity is a huge issue and has driven a lot of political instability in regions like sort of Nigeria, the northern part of Nigeria, and the Lake Chad Basin, and the Horn of Africa, where water scarcity has led to political strife. And we think about the impact of the increasing number of data centers that we're seeing across the continent and how they could be consuming resources that could exaggerate the sort of scarcity that we already have in play. And then I think that it's important to think about bias in AI, but I think we should also kind of diversify our focus and ensure that we're encapsulating all of the risks that AI poses beyond just bias.
Abake, what can be done to mitigate some of these risks in the AI value chain, for example, and also in the final output for the consumer?
Yeah, I think in terms of mitigating risks, I think that there's sort of three sort of perspectives that I would take. So there's the perspective of the solution developer. So from the way that the continent, or most countries in the continent, are positioned, we're largely consumers of software that's developed outside of the continent. And so there's definitely a risk of bad actors introducing misinformation. There's a risk of models that aren't trained to adapt to a local context. There's the risk of just models that aren't necessarily tailored for the use cases that we have that are relevant to Africa. I think from a solution developer, that's where it's on developers to make sure that models are trained in a way that's flexible, where appropriate, tailored to the consumer's context to ensure that you're delivering a product that ultimately doesn't exaggerate the biases that could introduce these sort of adverse consequences. And then I think that from another perspective, you have the consumer. So we live, obviously, in the information age where even outside of the presence of AI, we're just consuming information from a lot of resources, a lot of sources, and we're consuming probably far more information than any other generation of human has consumed in the history of humanity. We're exposed to far more information. And so I think that it's important to adopt a level of discernment in terms of how we're consuming information. So yes, an AI solution provider can improve the quality of their model output. They can even introduce tools like watermarking to let consumers know that, this information that you're consuming is like synthetic or was generated from such and such source. But it's still on the consumer, at least the role the consumer needs to play in this sort of three-part dance, is to really be discerning in how we consume information online and information that could be generated by quote-unquote AI or synthetic sources, and adopting a level of skepticism and also being a bit more rigorous in validating the information that we're consuming and maybe not always assuming that everything that we see online is correct. I think, the consumer, unfortunately, the fact that we live in this information age puts this burden on us, and we kind of, for the sake of self-preservation, have to manage our role in that context. And then I think that the third part in this sort of dynamic is the role of governments and supranational agencies in terms of introducing regulatory frameworks and laws around data privacy, data governance, to establish the context in which enterprises interact with consumers, to ensure that there are guardrails in place to mitigate risks around data consumption, data utilization, data dissemination, and ensuring that there are consequences in place for the spread of misinformation, but obviously all within the context of preserving free speech. So it's a sort of a delicate balance, and we see that these risks they're very clear and present. I mean, I could use the example of a recent presidential election in Nigeria, where the leading opposition candidate did not ultimately win the election or was not declared the winner. And there was a conversation that the opposition candidate had with a pastor, a very popular pastor, that was leaked online, and supporters of the opposition candidate claimed that this conversation was a deep fake because it potentially compromised the presentation of this opposition candidate, who was a sort of reform candidate. And the likelihood, and I think some journalists investigated this recording and found that it wasn't a deep fake, but it sort of muddied the waters, and it heightened already intense perspectives on the outcome of the election. Similarly in Kenya, that TikTok's algorithm sort of helped amplify politically incendiary content around the election, which ultimately led to or contributed to electoral violence. And so I think definitely the consequences are very real in terms of potential impact or perception of impact of AI. And I think it's all the more reason why every sort of actor in this sort of what I call this three-part dance needs to play their role to help mitigate risk. But I think the risk is ultimately a reality and not something that can be removed in its entirety.
How can AI be used to combat misinformation and information pollution?
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to my response to the earlier question, where I think that using AI to combat misinformation generated by AI or otherwise may in itself be a tricky, if not flawed, proposition, because AI in itself is not perfect. And the beauty of AI, I think it's kind of like the beauty of when we moved from like the analogs to the digital era. So when we moved from analog to digital, we gained a lot of benefits in that, information could be stored in a way that made it much more fungible, compressible, much easier to share. And it allowed us to build solutions that could manipulate data in ways that were efficient. But when you move from analog to digital, you naturally lose some amount of quality. And I think the AI, we can think about this sort of transition to AI in a similar way. So AI allows us to process a large amount of information at scale with relatively minimum resources, but it's not perfect. It's not a genie. And I think that if we're looking for a solution that will help us handle something as nuanced and as delicate as misinformation, AI can help at scale identify sort of maybe egregious content, or it can help identify content that may be generated synthetically. Like I mentioned earlier, there are companies that are, for example, adding watermarks to synthesized images, or even at Ajala, we're in the process of adding watermarks to all synthetic audio that we generate. So there are ways that AI can be used to help provide a context to consumers to help them distinguish what is real, quote unquote, from what is not real. And it can help in this sort of information age where there's so much information, provide a bulk tool for reviewing a large amount of information and identifying roughly what's quote unquote good or bad. But ultimately, these tools are not perfect, and the filtering of these filtering of content of information naturally has political consequences. So you are ultimately having to define what is good and what is bad, which obviously is not always a universal context. And companies that are trying to operate as quote unquote neutral have to embrace or are forced to embrace some political leanings that may not necessarily be in line with their initial motivation. So, and even then, even if they do wholeheartedly adopt these sort of political definitions of good or bad or social or, context-specific definitions, there's also the fact that the models are not going to be perfect in their ability to execute these classifications. And so I think that, yes, we can use AI, but ultimately we live in a world that is nuanced, human, flawed, imperfect, and we still have to interact with each other. And we still have to have this sort of human element where we're all trying to work together towards improving whatever context we're operating in. It's for the better, but with the knowledge that whatever tools we're using aren't always going to be the best, be they AI, be they human, be they, some third alien form. And I think that we can only kind of iterate every day and trying to correct mistakes of the past and work to make the future better.
That's all from us at Science Explained today. If you want to find out more, head to the SciDevNet website. That's www.scidev.net. Today's show was produced by Alice Hurst, with editing and hosting by me, Ogechi Ekeanyo, and the reporter was Michael Kaluki. Until next time, goodbye. Africa Science Focus is produced by SciDevNet and distributed in association with a local radio station.